Thank you, Maud. How about if I sit down and let Adrian Oxley do another riff? I wish I could, but I've got to say something. It's tradition. Maud began by thanking the faculty, the staff, and you for coming back. Something like 80% of your class is here today. I think that's amazing. I lift my hat to you. I was trying to decide whether to use my academic hat or my Indiana Jones hat, but I think you deserve the Indiana Jones hat. Well done, class of 2020. Maud, you thanked faculty, staff. I would like to thank you. I've been here a long time, and I've seen a lot of presidents pass through Hopkins Hall. I've never seen one confront the challenges that Maud Mandel has confronted beginning in March of 2020. And I can't tell you how much it's meant to all of us to have your steady hand on the tiller during these trying times. And I hope you'll join me in applauding our president. Okay, I've heard a lot of commencement addresses in my years here, and I remember almost none of them. The ones I remember had three things in common. They were short, hold your applause, it'll just take time. They were short, they were autobiographical, and they left us, me, all of us, with something to remember as we left these hallowed grounds. And so I'm going to follow that roadmap today. Brief, autobiographical. I hope to leave you with something that you remember. I'm going to start with something autobiographical with a heavy emphasis on my growing up and my coming to Williams as a student, arriving on this campus in 1954. I'm going to talk a little bit about my time as a faculty member, but it's really the time that I spent in the Jim Crow South on the white side of the color line and coming to Williams. That's the story that I want to tell you today. I have actually written about this. Most academics lead such dull lives they never write about it. I've written about it. The book, as Maud mentioned, is entitled The Making of a Racist. UVA Press, 2016. It's overpriced. It's $18.95 for this thin paperback. But if you buy it, you get my baby picture. And I was a really good-looking kid. It's been a long downhill slide since then, but take a look. When I was sitting on my mother's lap. What prompted me to write this book? That's the document that the QR scan is in your program about. I know that it's not going to be possible for most of you to scan that. If you can scan it, take a look at it. It's what prompted me to write my book, The Making of a Racist. I'm going to take a minute or two just to comment on this. This is one of the most horrific pieces of paper I've ever seen in my life because it conveys the essence of the American South slave system. Human beings as property, the chattel principle. Human beings bought and sold like livestock. I first saw this document when Bob Volz, the Chapin librarian, called me in my office in Hollander Hall. And he said, Charles, we've got something here I think you need to look at. I walked over to Chapin, and when Bob put this document in my hand, I had a visceral reaction of revulsion. I felt like somebody had slugged me in the stomach. Because what he had handed me was a broadside issued by the Richmond slave trading firm of Betts and Gregory in August of 1860, listing men, women, and children for sale. Number one, men, extra men, second-rate or ordinary men. Extra girls, number one, second-rate or ordinary. Boys, 4 feet high, children sold by height. And then the clerk has written in a clerk's handwriting, 19th century, a little note at the bottom that begins, good young woman and first child. 1300 to 1450. Good young woman and first child. You were not only buying her and her baby, you were buying the promise of her future increase. And that would accrue to the wealth of the master or the mistress who bought this young woman and her first child. She had demonstrated that she could bear children. She was a special item in the slave trade. My revulsion was, as I said, visceral. And then I had a moment, a sort of clarifying moment. My ancestors, all of them, had been antebellum white Southerners. They hadn't been slave traders, but they had been complicit in this. And one of them, Thomas Roderick Dhu, who was the president of the College of William and Mary, had written the first really fundamental defense of the institution of slavery, published in 1832. So that was my heritage. How could they have been complicit in this? How could they not have seen what was right in front of them? And then I had that moment in which I asked myself a critical question. Charles, how could you have done the same thing growing up on the white side of the color line in the Jim Crow South? How could I have looked Jim Crow racial segregation in the face every day? It was omnipresent in St. Petersburg, Florida when I grew up. Cradle to grave segregation. How could I have looked that in the face every day and not seen what was staring me in the face? And that's what I had done. I arrived on the Williams College campus as a racist. No other way to call it. And I want to talk to you a little bit, not for very long, but I want to talk to you about how that was created. By the way, if you're interested in translating those $1860 into present day purchasing power, the multiplier is 37. Each one of those dollar figures multiplied by 37 will get you that price for a human being in today's money. I could say a lot about the slave system in the South, but that would take too long. I decided I would do two things. I decided I would try to get inside the mind of the people who generated this document, the slave traders or customers, and I would like to understand my own upbringing. They were complicit in this. I was complicit in growing up in a racist society on the white side of the color line and buying in, full tilt. How had that happened? Well, I did two things. I read the slave traders' correspondence, most dismal research effort I've ever undertaken. I wanted to get inside the mind. To get inside my own mind, I had to think back on my own history and think back to my growing up and why that process made me a racist. My baby picture on the cover, I'm sitting in my mother's lap, and that's an appropriate picture because the first thing I remember about my life was sitting in my mother's lap and having her read this children's book to me entitled Ezekiel, and it's all in a very broad African-American dialect. It's about a little colored boy who lives on the St. Johns River in South Carolina. The names are funny. His baby's Asafoetida, his sister's Emancipation. This my mother read to me, my first memory. And my mother was a lovely person. She was kind, she was Christian. She was the kind of person you walk into a room and you feel better after you meet this person. My gentle, compassionate, deeply religious mother thought nothing about reading this book to me. And that was my start in life. Who are these people? They're different. They look funny. They talk funny. They dress funny. They're not like us. Those are my first memories as a human being. My father was a lawyer, first member of his family to go to college. He moved down to St. Petersburg to practice law. He was a wonderful wit. He was highly intelligent. He could crack jokes. He was a good father, but he was a dyed-in-the-wool racist. He wore his racism on his sleeve. He referred to people of color by names that my mother would not allow my older brother John and I to use, and that was my father. A gentle mother, a racist father, and I growing up essentially buying in. I think the process, as I think back on it, was osmosis. I absorbed the culture that was around me. I noticed that my father never shook hands across the color line, My mother and father never referred to a person of color, including the people who worked for us, except by their first names. No Mr., no Mrs., no Miss. We had a nicely appointed tile bathroom on the second floor of our house. Ed, the man who mowed the grass in Illinois Brown and Culver, woman I'm going to refer to very quickly. Illinois and Ed used a very poorly appointed bathroom off the back porch. That was the world I grew up in, and the most vivid memory I have as a child occurred when I was 8 years old, and a man of color who owned a shoe shine parlor downtown named Bill Williams. My father had his shoes shined there, and Bill Williams was a black man who had made a very good living for himself. And something had happened when my father was having his shoes shine the previous day. And I think maybe my father overheard a comment, I'm not sure. But Bill came to our house early in the morning to apologize, to get my father's business back. And as he walked across the lawn, he came to the wrong door of our house. He didn't come to the back door, where African Americans were always supposed to come. He came to a side door. And my father erupted in rage. I had never heard him talk like that, scream like that. I was terrified. I was 8 years old. I can remember it as if it was yesterday. That's the world I grew up in, and that's the world I brought with me to campus in 1954. My education at Williams began before I went in my first classroom. I lived in Williams F, up on the top floor. Any of you Williams Hall frosh? Okay, we share that in common. And I had an African American classmate. The first time in my life I had ever been on a level playing field with an African American. The first time I had ever been out of that Jim Crow culture where whites were up here, black folks were down here. And I did something that I am so embarrassed by the second day I was on the Williams College campus, that I never told this story to anyone until Leslie Brown and I were teaching a winter study class together in 2016 called The South in Black and White. And we were reading autobiographies across the color line. And the students were so great, the mood in that class was so fantastic that I, for the first time, felt comfortable for telling this story. And I'm going to tell you now, and I'm embarrassed to this day to have to tell you this. I was in a classmate's second day on campus. I was in a classmate's dorm room on the third floor, on the stairs. Door was open. I was telling a dialect joke. All my humor was race-based. And I was doing a a deep baritone for the Rastus character in the joke, and I was doing a falsetto for Lulabelle, the female character in the joke. And as I was telling the joke, my African-American classmate, Ted Wynn, walked down the stairs of Williams F, and I froze. Had he heard me? My mother had taught my brother and I to be decent, kind, generous people, never to humiliate anyone else, never to humiliate ourselves. I was fearful I had done both, and I had to know. So the next morning, as Ted was coming out of the dorm and we were crossing the quad to go to breakfast, I stopped him and I said, "Ted, I'm Charles Dew, we're in your entry," and I stuck out my hand. That's the first time I had shaken hands across the color line with my classmate, Ted Wynn. He said, "Hi, Charles, I'm Ted Wynn, I'm from Worcester, Massachusetts. Glad to know you. I'm sure we'll be friends." We were. We became good friends. And my years at Williams were responsible for transforming my life. I cannot tell you the debt of gratitude I feel toward this institution, both for giving me that experience when I was a young man, between 17 and 21, and inviting me back as a faculty member where I have spent the best years of my life. Williams means everything to me, and I'm not ashamed to say it. I had great history professors here. Robert C.L. Scott, Bob Scott, taught me Southern history, blew all my Confederate history right out of the water, made me decide to go to grad school and study the South, try to understand this place. So that's what I did. Never thought that I would get back here, but it happened. Luckiest day of my life, I think, was being invited to join the Williams faculty. As I began to change my attitudes, I decided that I really wanted to talk to the African-American woman who had worked for us for years. Her name was Illinois Browning Culver. And my book is dedicated to her, and for a reason. I wanted to find out what her life was like, what it was like to live on her side of the color line in St. Petersburg. So I volunteered to drive her home after she finished work at our house. That would keep her from taking the bus where she had to go to the back seat. And she said, "That's great, I'd love to do that, Charles." So we drove back and forth. And one day I wanted to break the ice and see if she would talk to me. I knew her son, Roosevelt. They had one son. She and her husband, Joe, had one son, Roosevelt. He had left St. Petersburg as soon as he was old enough to get out, gone to California, gotten a good job, I think, with an airline. I said, "Illinois, it's a shame Roosevelt had to leave St. Petersburg because of something like race." And she looked over at me and she was silent. This was dangerous territory for her. We never talked about social justice in the Jim Crow South. She had to trust me, and she did. And after a long pause, she said, "Charles, it is a shame he had to leave St. Petersburg because of something like race." And she began to tell me about her life, and that just opened up a world to me, that her life in St. Petersburg was confined by how she looked. She told me the department stores downtown would sell her a dress, wouldn't let her try it on. When she got home, if she tried it on and it didn't fit, she couldn't bring it back. She told me the green benches that lined the streets of St. Petersburg were Jim Crow benches. If black folks tried to sit on those green benches and take in the sun, the cops would roust them. She told me things that just changed my life, and I can't thank her enough for trusting me. I know this sounds like a kind of great grade B movie, well-meaning white folks being educated by their African-American domestic servants. It sounds like a cliche, a stereotype. Well, those things happen, those cliches and stereotypes happen, and that happened to me. And I am so grateful to her for doing that. One day when we were driving home, she said something to me that will get me to my conclusion. I don't know how I got on this conversation, but we were talking about these insane Jim Crow customs, the different water fountains, all this stuff. And I was saying something along the lines of, "Illinois, where does this stuff come from?" And she looked over at me and she was almost in tears. And she said, "Charles, why do the grown-ups put so much hate in the children? Why do the grown-ups put so much hate in the children?" And I knew as soon as she said it, she had absolutely nailed it. That's exactly what had been going on. Racism was passed down from generation to generation, generation among white Southerners, almost like a genetic trait. And that's what had happened to me. So in conclusion, I want to suggest a couple of things I hope you will carry away with you. Short, autobiographical, something to carry away. We're at part 3, folks. I hope that you will never support a political party or a politician that plays the race card. American democracy depends on it. Don't vote for them, don't give them money, call them out for what they are. Don't tell jokes that demean people. Don't tell jokes in dialect. Don't tell jokes about minorities. They're not very funny. And that story I told you about telling that joke lives with me. And I wish I had never done it. I don't think you should stand idly by if you hear racism spoken, if you hear somebody say something racist. This is tough. If you grow up in the South like I did, good manners are equated with good character. And it's bad manners to call somebody out for saying something that clearly they shouldn't say. I think the time for silence on this has passed. I think it's over. Have the guts to say something when you hear something racist. This is extremely important. Give up your stereotypes. We all have them. And we particularly have them about people who we don't know very well, or people who look different from us, or people who are from other parts of the world. Give up your stereotypes. They are pernicious. Let me illustrate that. This is a fact I'm sure the students in my class remember. The stereotype of the antebellum Southern black woman was one of two. You were either a mammy or you were a Jezebel. The mammies took care of the white folks' kids. They were a sort of organic bridge between the black world and the white world. They loved our children more than they loved their own, white people said. The mammy was one stereotype. The other stereotype was the Jezebel, the promiscuous black female. And the age of consent in South Carolina until 1895 was 10 years old. And when the Constitutional Convention came to revise that upward, they did, moved it to 14. Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who ran South Carolina politics, argued strenuously against raising the age of consent. Innocent white men might be entrapped by legally ruined by adolescent black seductresses, he said. The age of consent in Delaware, which was another formerly slave state, was 7 in the late 19th century. That traces directly back to this stereotype. Finally, I hope that you will take that advice that Illinois Culver gave me on that ride home when I was taking her from our house to hers. Don't pass racism on in any form to any children about anybody. Please, I know what I'm talking about here. The power of that Jim Crow culture was astonishing. And my parents, as much as they love me, gave me a heritage that they shouldn't have. As Illinois Culver said, Charles, why do the grown-ups put so much hate in the children? Please, don't do it. Thank you.